Cole Maddox froze when the young girl clung to his coat, whispering a name he hadn't heard in years. Just before a Comanche woman rode out of the dusk, eyes sharp as flint. "Step aside, cowboy," she said, her voice steady as river stone. "She's one of ours." The words cut the air, stirring old guilt he thought the prairie winds had buried. Cole stepped back, stunned, the truth flickering through him like firelight. Because if that child truly belonged to her people, then someone out here had been lying for a very long time. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. Cole Maddox eased his tired mare into the trading post yard as dusk smudged the horizon and the world narrowed to the smell of tar, coffee, and dust. Thinking he would spend 10 minutes, trade a battered pocket watch for a sack of flour, and be gone before the stars thickened. Then a tiny hand clung to his coat and a whisper slid through him like a blade. "Emma," the child breathed, and that single name once pulled a rope of memory he had knotted away years ago. A name that tasted of firelight in a winter that had not forgiven him. And in the breath between heartbeats, a woman rode out of the dim like a shadow given purpose, her horse's breath fogging the air, her eyes hard as river flint, her posture carrying the kind of command that makes men in saloons stop mid-sentence. "Step aside, cowboy," she said, voice steady and low. "She's one of ours." And those words hit Cole with the force of a prairie gale because they did what he had been certain nothing could do. Pull open the scab of an old wound and show the dark beneath. For if this child belonged to the Comanche, then the ledger of his past might not be as settled as he'd told himself. And maybe, God helped him, someone had been lying all this time. He felt the trading post boards under his boots like the planks of a jury box. He felt the heat where shame had always lived in him, an ember he had convinced himself was cold, and the girl's eyes, wide and wet, darted between him and the woman with a trust so sudden it embarrassed him. Sihina, the writer's name, lived in the tilt of her chin and the set of her jaw. She did not smile. She did not plead. She only named the claim on the child with a calm that suggested courts and councils he had never attended. And while other patrons shuffled and tried to pretend that a thing so dangerous as truth was not happening in their midst, Cole's mind lined up the pieces he had been careful to scatter. An abandoned cabin, a raid that smelled of smoke and burned cloth, a lawman with a scar once called Cole brother, and the sound of horses running like a rumor of trouble. He could have turned away, handed Emma to Sihina and ridden off into the night, but the girl's small hand tightened on his coat as if she had found a last margin of safety, and Cole felt something he had not allowed himself in years, an obligation not written in any law but etched into the medicine of decency. Words rose in his throat that wanted to be confession, but his mouth closed around them. He was a man who had learned to speak with deeds, not excuses, and the trading post, that thin shelter between open plain and the unknown, became the stage for a decision. Stand aside and let a history rewrite itself without him, or step into the light and see what the truth demanded. Sihina's gaze never left the child. It was careful, not triumphal, a long river of grief and fierce clarity. And Cole recognized bitterness he had no right to blame on her. Around them, the air tightened, people's breaths counted like clocks, because in a place where promises had been broken and lives bartered as if they were cattle, a single claim could lead to reconciliation or blood, and Cole's chest felt full of both possibilities. He remembered a promise he'd once broken to a man named Braddock, the man with the scar, and remembered the way loyalty had been taught to him as a currency. Now loyalty demanded a reckoning. Emma tucked her chin to Cole's coat, trusting the shape of him more than any stranger's words, and Cole, stunned by the simple authority of Sihina and by the child's faith, stepped back, not out of surrender but out of the old habit of measuring the weight of a moment before choosing how to carry it. And as horses shifted in the lot and a dog snarled somewhere, he realized the prairie had never really let him go. It kept its stats, and tonight someone was collecting. Cole felt the girl's grip like an anchor and the ledger of his life tilt under its weight, and his small hand did not loosen. Her fingers dug into the wool of his coat as if she feared the world would pry her free, and when she jabbed a trembling finger toward the distant line of hills, Cole saw, not silhouettes but questions, the kind that pressed like winter through a man's ribs. "Riders," she mouthed, and then that name again. Braddock, spoken so soft it might have been a dream, and the sound knifed through him because Braddock was a name that lived in the cracks of his memory with flames behind it. A man who had once called him brother and taught him how to read both the smell of fear and the weight of a gun. And Cole felt the old geography of loyalty rearrange itself into something ugly and unfamiliar. Around them the trading post hummed with careless talk and clinking spoons, but the edge of the lot had already gone still, the way a room hushes when wolves pack outside a thin wall. Emma kept pointing, her lips moving like a prayer, and every motion of hers was a map back to nights Cole had tried to bury. Burned planks, a crib turned like a fallen star, the metallic promise of a badge that meant law to some and terror to others, and he realized with a stomach-turning clarity that the choice before him was no longer theoretical. Protect this frightened child whose name unreeled the past, or hand her to the woman who claimed her and be done with the tremor of accusation that chased the sound of his own boots. He could see the easy path. Step back, say the law will handle it, let Sahina lead the girl away, right into the dark and file the memory under things not his to mend. That path smelt of ash and cowardice, both in his throat closed on the thought. Because for all the things he'd become, he was still a man who'd once promised more in a different life. Promises made in the damp of saloons, promises broken under adobe roofs, and the girl's trust seared him. Sahina stood like a tree carved of river stone, eyes unblinking, and there was a patience in her that could be cruel or healing. She did not snatch Emma, nor did she demand with the hunger of a thief. She asserted with the quiet of someone who had walked a long road and kept the map of grief in her hand. Cole watched the woman's jaw work once, a small human motion that betrayed a history, and he felt the old shame climb up his spine. The shame of living in the shadow of choices that had been bought with other people's sorrow. And in that shame came a calculation of risk. The riders on the ridge could be Braddock's men, looking to finish a job they thought long closed. If they were, crossing swords for a child meant blood either way. And Cole had been counting his life and debts he could no longer pay with silence. Emma's eyes found his, and in them was a question without artifice, the kind only children are brave enough to ask. Are you with me? His hands, which had been steady enough to gut a steer or pull a body from a frozen river, trembled beneath the girl's weight, and with a sound like a man letting go of a rope he had held too long, he made the choice that would mark him. He stepped forward, not away, and said no promises in words but in action. He would not hand her over without knowing the whole truth. He would not let the past be settled by men who made bargains in smoke and fear. The trading post seemed to exhale around them. Patrons shifted, some angry at the disturbance, some secretly pleased for drama. But Cole felt only the heavy quiet of a decision land on him like rain on dry earth, terrifying, necessary, and cleansing. And as Emma pressed closer, head against his chest, Cole turned his face to the ridge and readied himself for whatever truth, and whoever, rode down those distant hills. Sahina spoke her name with a steadiness that seemed carved from stone, each syllable carrying the weight of long trails and longer sorrows. And Cole felt the sound settle over the trading post like a shadow no lantern could chase away. Her voice was cold, yes, but beneath that cold lived something older than anger, a kind of wounded patience that made Emmett hug closer to Cole's side, her small body trembling as if she recognized the truth before either adult dared name it. And when Sahina said the child had been stolen, taken from her people weeks ago by white riders who moved like buzzards across the plains, her gaze locked onto Cole with a precision that made him feel skinned, as though she were reading not only the dust on his coat but the memories he kept buried under layers of silence. The space between them thickened, humming with the tension of unspoken accusations, and Cole felt that familiar pinch in his ribs, the one that came whenever the past he tried to outrun reached forward with its cold hand. He tried to meet Sahina's eyes without flinching, but saw in them a ledger of grief and suspicion, and every second of her searching stare seemed to ask its own verdict. What do you know, cowboy? And what weight do you carry that you're too proud, or too afraid, to admit? The girl's fingers dug deeper into his coat, her breath hitching, and Cole found himself caught between two roads, duty pulling him one way, guilt tugging him the other, because protecting a child was simple, instinctive, the kind of choice a man could make without thinking. But the history tangled behind Emma's presence, the hollow ring of Sahina's claim, and the ghost of that cursed name she whispered all brightened into something far more complicated. He remembered Braddock's iron grin, The smoke from the cabin they'd once raided, the sound of a child crying in the dark, memories blurred by time yet sharp enough to cut, and wondered whether Emma was a piece of that old puzzle he'd refused to examine. Sahina stepped closer, her posture calm but her hands restless at her sides, fingers brushing against the beadwork on her belt as if touching some quiet source of strength. And she spoke again, softer this time, about how Emma had vanished in the chaos of a raid meant to break her people's spirit, how Sahina had hunted every trail, questioned every traitor, searched every known outlaw camp just to stitch together the truth of what had been taken from them. Cole heard the tremor beneath her restrained, a mother's fury layered with the exhaustion of chasing hope through hostile country, and he felt shame churn low in his chest, not because he had taken the child but because he had ridden with men capable of doing such things and had once justified it as the way of the frontier. Around them, the trading posts seemed to shrink, boards creaking as if listening, lantern flames flickering as though uncertain which direction the wind of fate would blow, and Cole forced himself to speak though his voice rasped with something close to confession. He told Sahina he didn't know who had taken Emma, not yet, but the girls fearing the riders on the ridge said enough to convince him trouble was clawing its way toward them. Sahina's jaw tightened, not accusing but assessing, and Cole could feel her measuring him, his stance, his tone, the tremble he barely hid, as though deciding whether he was protector or threat, ally or memory of every white man who had ever broken trust with their people. The guilt stirring inside him rose like smoke from a dying fire, thick, choking, undeniable, and he realized that whatever came next, whatever truth Emma carried, whatever danger followed, he could not stand on the edges of this story. He was already woven into it, and the prairie had a cruel habit of demanding payment from those who pretended they owed nothing at all. Sahina's voice lowered into that solemn, rhythmic timbre reserved for truth too painful to speak plainly, and as she told Cole how her tribe had searched for Emma since the night white renegades tore through their camp like a brush fire unleashed by wicked hands, he felt the temperature around them shift, the dusk deepening as though the sky itself listened. She spoke of men with torches and rifles, men who didn't wear uniforms but carried themselves with the confidence of those who believed no law would ever find them, men who stole horses, grain, and finally a child who wasn't born to the Comanche but had been taken in, loved, protected, until that night shattered everything, and the way she said it made the trading post walls seem to curl inward with the memory of smoke. Cole's breath caught, because her description of the raid echoed one he had witnessed long ago on the edge of Red Hollow, a cabin burning, a family screaming, the night alive with the cruel laughter of men who lived for chaos, and leading them, worse than all the others, was Braddock, a man Cole had once called brother, a man who'd worn a silver badge only long enough to twist the meaning of justice into something he could pocket. Cole felt his stomach knot as the memory sharpened, Braddock's scar glinting in firelight, the whip crack of his orders, the way he'd boasted after that night about seizing assets from men who paid well to stir conflict between settlers and tribes. And even though Cole had left Braddock soon after, the guilt that clung to him now felt like a brand he'd never scrubbed clean. Sahina watched him closely, her eyes narrowing just slightly, as if she sensed the shift in his breathing, the way his shoulders drew tight, not with anger, but with recognition, and she pressed on, telling him how every trail the renegades left dissolved into dust, how they had vanished into canyons and riverbeds like ghosts who understood too well how to erase their tracks, and how her people had split into small groups, searching, bargaining, praying, each passing day sharpening grief into determination. Emma, hearing her story, had gone quiet, as if some piece of it rang true in the dim places of her mind where trauma hid its fragments, and Cole felt the girl tremble against him, her fear a reminder that innocence was always what suffered most when men like Braddock carved their paths across the frontier. He tried to still the trembling in his hands, but as Sahina described the night of the raid, torches swinging, rifles firing, the renegades shouting for everyone to scatter, Cole saw, unbidden, the image of a man carrying a screaming child under his arm like stolen cargo, and the certainty settled into him with a heaviness he wished he could deny. Braddock had done this, or men trained by him, men shaped by his ruthless logic that people were tools, weapons, or burdens. A coincidence? No. The frontier had too few shadows for coincidences of this kind. Sahina must have seen the flicker in his eyes because her voice softened. losing its sharp edge, though not its force, and she asked him, without accusation, without threat, if he recognized anything in what she described. Cole wanted to lie, to say no, to say the world was wild and wicked and raids like that happened without pattern. But lying now would be like placing another stone atop a pile that would one day crush someone else. Instead, he looked toward the ridge where the sun had bled itself dry, and in that fading light he felt the truth settle like a burden across his back. The rage she spoke of might be tied to the same men who had shaped him, the same violence he had once ridden alongside, and the fear that rose in him wasn't for himself but for what Sahina might see if she ever glimpsed the man he used to be. The connection wasn't just possible, it was likely, and as the night deepened around them, Cole Maddox understood with breathless clarity that the past he'd hoped was dead had begun to stir, and it was coming toward them with a sound of hooves on dry earth. Cole knelt to Emma's height, the rough boards of the trading post floor creaking under his weight, and tried with a gentleness he hadn't used in years to coax words from her trembling lips. But the girl's memories came out in jagged fragments: burning cabin, silver badge, a man with a scar, and each piece struck cold with the force of a stone hurled by fate itself. Because those images were not random horrors plucked from the prairie's long ledger of cruelty but markers on a map that led straight into the darkest chapter of his own life, a chapter inked in blood, smoke, and choices he'd told himself he had been too young or too desperate to refuse. Emma pressed her face into his coat, her breath warm and uneven, and when he gently asked who carried her from the fire, she shook her head violently, only repeating scar, badge, fire, her small hands curling into fists as if the act of remembering burned her fingertips, and Cole felt the world around them narrow into a tunnel where only truth and consequence mattered. A silver badge, Braddock's symbol, tarnished by misuse but still flashing like a promise to those who trusted the wrong kind of justice, and a scar, the jagged one that cut from his brow to his jaw, the wound he'd earned in a brawl Cole had once helped him stagger away from. That combination was unmistakable, undeniable, a fingerprint of cruelty left on a child who should have never known such terror. Cole swallowed hard, tasting dust and guilt, the kind that sits thick in the throat and refuses to move, and the memory rushed back with startling clarity. The night the renegades rode toward the homestead near Red Hollow, the way Braddock had slipped behind the burning cabin while the others looted grain and horses, muttering something about unfinished business, and how Cole, younger then, had turned away, choosing not to see, not to know, because the truth behind Braddock's errands was always uglier than the lies that had planned them. And now the child was here, trembling under his hand, living proof of what he had failed to stop. He asked if she remembered a voice, a name, a code, anything that might anchor the truth more firmly. But Emma only squeezed her eyes shut and whispered, "Don't let him take me," her voice cracking like thin ice, and the words stabbed into Cole with a guilt sharper than any blade. How could he tell her that the man she feared had once ridden beside him, had once trusted him enough to share firelight and camp bread, had once spoken of shaping the frontier with steel and resolve? Sahina watched from a few steps away, her posture rigid, her eyes flickering between Emma and Cole as if trying to read which of them carried the heavier burden, and Cole felt its scrutiny like a brand because he knew she sensed the shift in his breathing, the haunted way he looked at the hills, the way his jaw clenched whenever the girl mentioned fire. He wanted to shield Emma from every ghost that lived in her broken memories, yet he knew that doing so without confronting the truth would only repeat the same cowardice that defined his past. The lantern light cast long shadows across the floorboards, and in those wavering silhouettes Cole seemed to see versions of himself, one running, one fighting, one standing still while the world burned around him, and he knew he had to choose which man he would be tonight. Emma's fragments had opened a wound he'd long pretended was healed, and the pain of it was almost welcome, because pain was honest in a way he rarely allowed himself to be. He told Emma softly that no one would take her while he breathed, and though he meant the words, the promise tasted dangerous, binding him to a path he knew would end in blood if Braddock truly rode behind whatever shadows stalked the ridge. As Emma's trembling eased slightly beneath his hand, Cole understood with grim certainty that the past had found him through this child's broken memories, and there was no trail left that did not lead straight into reckoning. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. "All right then. Let's get back on the trail." Night slid over the plains like a heavy blanket, swallowing the last scraps of color until only the faint glow from the trading post windows held back the dark, and in that dimness Suhina's patience finally cracked. She stepped forward with a firmness sharpened by weeks of desperate searching and said she would take him now, tonight, before the trail grew colder, before danger found them again. Her voice tight with urgency and the kind of grief that had no room left for negotiation. But before Cole could answer, before he could sort through the tangle of fear, guilt, and duty twisting inside him, a gunshot tore the night open, echoing across the ridge like a lightning strike without a storm. And the girl screamed, burying her face in Cole's coat as two more shots cracked. Then another, the rhythm unmistakable. Men sending signals, men marking distance, men closing in. Suhina froze, every muscle taut, her gaze snapping toward the dark hills where faint silhouettes flickered against the starlight, riders shifting like wolves testing the edge of campfire aglow. Cole felt his blood run cold as understanding struck him. These weren't opportunistic bandits or passing drunks. These were the same renegades who had stolen Emma, the same brand of men Braddock had trained to move silently, strike fast, and leave nothing but fear behind, meaning the child was never meant to vanish cleanly into their hands. She was a piece of unfinished business, and now that she had slipped free, they would not stop until they reclaimed her or killed whoever stood in their way. Suhina reached instinctively for Emma, but the girl clung to Cole, and something in Suhina's eyes flickered. Frustration, yes, but also a reluctant trust, as though she recognized that the child felt safer with him not because of his past but because of the way he shielded her now. Another shot rang out, closer this time, pinging off the metal bucket near the well, and Cole cursed under his breath, grabbing Suhina's arm and pulling her toward the trading post door even as she resisted for half a heartbeat, pride and fear wrestling inside her, until another shadow darted across the ridge and she yielded, allowing him to shove Emma inside first. The trading post, dimly lit and long abandoned by its owner for the night, became their shelter, the wooden walls thin but better than open air, and Cole dragged a heavy crate toward the door while Suhina killed the lantern with a swift, decisive motion, plunging them into a darkness so complete Cole could hear his own heartbeat thudding like a drum. Outside, hooves scraped against stone, men muttering in low tones that carried the cold promise of violence, and Cole knew without needing to see their faces that Braddock's influence lived in their movements, in the way they encircled the building without wasting bullets, in the quiet kerthumpus someone dismounting with the patience of a practiced hunter. Inside, Suhina pressed her back to the wall, the outline of her form barely visible, her breath even but sharp, and Cole could sense her weighing her options, her trust in him fragile and begrudging but rooted in necessity, because whatever differences lay between them, whatever cultural wounds or past sins stood like ghosts at their shoulders, the danger outside did not care. The renegades were hunting Emma, and by extension, them both. Cole reached for his revolver, feeling the old familiarity of steel in his hand, a sensation he both hated and relied upon, and he whispered, not loud enough for Emma to hear fear in his voice but soft enough for Suhina to understand, that they would have to stand together, watch the windows, wait for the men to make the first mistake. Suhina nodded, a single, slow dip of her chin that felt like an unspoken pact sealed in the shadows, and Emma, still trembling, crawled beneath the counter, eyes widening reflecting the faint sliver of moonlight leaking through a crack in the wall. The gunmen outside tightened their circle, their boots crunching on gravel, and Cole felt the night inhale, holding its breath around them. Whatever happened next would be written in bullets and choices, and he knew the frontier demanded payment from every soul who dared run from the truth. And tonight, that truth had come knocking on their thin wooden door. The dim room felt smaller with every passing heartbeat, the boards groaning under the weight of approaching danger as Cole shoved another crate against the door and Suhina pressed her ear to the wall, listening to the riders circle like vultures waiting for something inside to die, and in that cramped darkness their nerves frayed until the first spark of argument snapped between them. Suhina demanding to know why Emma clung to Cole as if he were a lifeline, her voice thick with suspicion sharpened by generations of betrayal, while Cole pushed back, saying trust wasn't handed out like rations but turned in moments like this, moments where bullets might soon punch through the walls and a child's scream could mark the spot where they had failed. Suhina's jaw tightened, her words edged with bitterness as she reminded him that men who wore badges, silver, stolen, or sanctioned, had torn children from her people with the excuse of law. That Emma's memories of fire and scarred men were not isolated horrors but part of a long, blood-soaked pattern. And though her accusation wasn't directed at Cole personally, it crawled across his skin like a brand, stinging old wounds he'd tried to bury beneath years of wandering. Cole snapped back with a rough whisper, saying he wasn't like those men. But even as the words left his mouth, he felt the lie in them, a truth Sahina seemed to sense, her stare pinning him in the dark as though she could see the ghosts moving behind his eyes. He almost broke then, almost confessed everything. How he'd once ridden beside Braddock, how he'd turned away from things no decent man should ignore, how the smoke in Emma's memories wasn't just any fire but one he'd once watched burn from the shadow of a tree because he'd been too afraid to challenge the devil he'd called brother. But the urge to confess tangled with the knowledge that truth, spoken now, might shatter the fragile bridge forming between them, a bridge woven from shared fear for Emma, from the unspoken understanding that survival tonight depended not on history but on unity, however temporary or uneasy it might be. Outside, hooves thudded softly, riders spreading out on a slow, deliberate pattern that spoke of practiced killers waiting for the perfect opening, and Emma whimpered under the counter, her small hands covering her ears as if trying to shut out the world that hunted her. The sound cut through Sahina's anger like a blade through cloth, her eyes softening as she whispered that the child had already lost too much, that she would not lose her again. Not to renegades, not to fear, not to the echo of a past that refused to die. Cole nodded, feeling the weight of her resolve settle beside his own, and in the quiet that followed, something between them shifted. Not forgiveness, not trust, not yet, but a recognition of shared purpose, of shared responsibility. As though the danger outside had forced them into a truth both had resisted. They were on the same side, bound by the same need to keep Emma safe. The walls rattled with the faint scrape of boots, shadows sliding across the cracks as the riders tested windows and lantern light flickered through knots in the wood, and Cole tightened his grip on his revolver, feeling the familiar heaviness of impending violence settle into his bones. He could sense Sahina beside him, steady despite her anger, her presence a silent vow that whatever storm crashed through those doors, she would meet it head-on. Cole drew a slow breath and felt the words he'd swallowed pushing at his throat, demanding release, but he forced them back down, not out of cowardice this time, but because confession would not keep Emma alive. Bullets would not stop flying because he told the truth, and Sahina did not need his guilt tonight. She needed his resolve, his gun, his willingness to stand between Emma and the men who meant to break her spirit or claim her life. The sound of a rifle being cocked snapped through the night like a spine breaking, and Cole stepped forward, positioning himself by the window, shoulders squared, voice low but steady as he whispered to Sahina that when the shooting started, he would cover the eastern side, she would take the rear door, and together they would hold the line, come hell, fire, or the ghosts of the past clawing their way to the surface. The first bullet shattered the window before Cole even finished his sentence, spraying glass across the floor like shards of frozen rain, and the room exploded into chaos as Sahina spawned toward the rear door with the speed of someone who had survived raids before, her rifle raised, her breath steadied despite the tremor that ran through Emma's sobs beneath the counter. Cole dropped low, firing through the broken window at the shadowed figures darting between the hitching posts, each muzzle flash outside illuminating the killers like ghosts caught mid-snarl, and the desperation in his shots was matched only by Sahina's measured precision. Her bullets cutting clean arcs through the darkness, she held the narrow back entrance with the deadly calm of someone defending not just a child but a piece of her own soul. The renegades pushed hard, dusting every wall, firing in short, brutal bursts, trying to corner their prey inside the thin wooden shell of the trading post. But Cole and Sahina moved in a rhythm neither had discussed. A grim, instinctive dance born from survival, her voice sharp as she called warnings, his answers low and methodical as he reloaded, both of them leaning into the storm because there was no retreat, no second chance for Emma if they faltered even once. Smoke curled through the room, clinging to the boards in their skin, and Emma's frightened whimpers blended with the pounding of boots outside, the renegades circling for a stronger position until one tried to kick in the back door. Sahina met him with a single, devastating shot that sent his body collapsing into the dust, a dark shape swallowed by night, and the others hesitated, thrown off by the resistance they hadn't expected from two strangers protecting a child who wasn't even theirs by blood. Cole used that pause to surge forward, firing twice and catching another attacker in the shoulder, his silhouette crumpling beside the water trough, and the rest scattered, retreating into the deeper shadows where their horses waited. For a long, breathless moment, nothing moved but drift and gunpowder and the tremble of lantern light returning to life after the violence. Cole listened, heart hammering hard enough to shake his breath loose, until the sound of hooves faded into the distance, leaving only the wounded quiet of a building scarred but standing. Sahina lowered her rifle slowly, her hands shaking just a fraction before she steadied them, and Cole exhaled the kind of breath a man takes after stepping back from the edge of a cliff he hadn't realized he was dangling from. Emma crawled out from her hiding place, eyes red, face streaked with tears and dust, and clung to Sahina before reaching again for Cole, her fear choosing them both as anchors. The room felt too small for words, too heavy for silence, and yet the truth pressing on Cole's chest had grown so sharp during the firefight that he could no longer keep it buried beneath duty or fear. When Sahina asked, voice hoarse, who these men were and why they hunted a child so young with such vicious resolve, Cole felt that old, ugly shame rose from the depths like something dredged from a poisoned river. He looked away, jaw clenched, then confessed in a voice stripped of bravado that he once rode with a lawman named Braddock, a man he had admired, feared, and eventually fled, because Braddock had turned the badge into a weapon, shaping renegades from lost men and using raids to pit settlers against tribes until chaos lined his pockets. The name hit Sahina like a lash. She stepped toward him, eyes blazing with recognition and heartbreak twisted together, and whispered through clenched teeth that Braddock was the one who ordered Emma taken, the one who orchestrated the raid on her people, the man whose scar burned itself into the child's nightmares. The room tilted with the force of that revelation, a sickening knot tying Cole to the very horror Sahina had been fighting against, and though neither of them spoke for several breaths, the truth lay between them like a wounded animal, demanding acknowledgement, demanding reckoning, while outside, the darkness settled again, knowing dawn would bring the next battle, and the past Cole had tried to outrun was finally standing in front of him with a face, a name, and a trail soaked in fire. The gunpowder haze had barely settled when Sahina, still breathless from the fight yet anchored by a strength that seemed carved from the very stone of her homeland, gathered Emma close and spoke in a tone that cut through the smoke-thick silence like a slow, deliberate blade. She said the girl was not hers by blood, not born of her body, but taken into her tribe years ago after another raid, another night when white men swept through their camp like a scourge, leaving behind the wreckage of families torn apart in the faint, cruel cries of a child too young to understand that the world she'd known had been ripped from her hands. Emma, then barely more than a baby, had been found tucked beneath a shattered wagon, her tiny face streaked with ash and her hands clinging to a scrap of cloth as if it were the only memory she still possessed. Sahina hadn't planned to take her in that night, she'd said, but something in the child's trembling breath had reached into her chest and refused to let go, and from that moment, Emma had been theirs, fed, taught, protected, woven into the fabric of a people who knew better than anyone how to stitch fractured lives into new patterns. Cole listened, his body still tense from the firefight yet frozen by the quiet enormity of her words, and he felt a stirring inside him that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite all but something heavier, a recognition that the world he'd once believed in, the one that sorted people neatly into roles of settlers and savages, lawmen and outlaws, had been a lie written by the victors of every small war that scarred the land. Sahina didn't speak with the bitterness he expected. Instead, her voice carried the weary weight of someone who had long since understood that justice out here wasn't handed down from courts or badges but carved from choices made in the dirt, choices pressed upon those who had lost too much to pretend the world was fair. Emma looked up at her, eyes wide, as if sensing the story was both hers and not hers. And Cole felt something twist inside him, the knowledge that the girl wasn't a pawn in some simple tale of right and wrong, but a symbol of all the broken promises that haunted the frontier, of families shattered and reformed, of identities rewritten by survival rather than heritage. He thought of Braddock, of the raids they'd carried out under the guise of restoring order, of the children who'd stared at him with smoke-stung eyes as he'd ridden past pretending that someone else bore the blame, He thought of the badge that had once gleamed with false authority on Braddock's chest, and how many stories of pain had been justified by that thin piece of metal. The moral ground beneath Cole's feet seemed to shift, tilting under the weight of Sahina's truth, and he realized, slowly, painfully, that justice wasn't something he had ever truly understood. He'd been raised to believe it came from guns and gallows, from men like Braddock who preached order yet spread chaos. But now, watching Sahina hold a child she had chosen rather than birthed, he saw a different kind of justice, one shaped by compassion, resilience, and the courage to claim responsibility for the abandoned. The land around them felt suddenly vast, stretching with the echoes of old betrayals and unmarked graves, and Cole wondered how many children like Emma were living stories written in fire and stolen futures. He wondered what kind of man he had become by ignoring those stories for so long. Sahina met his gaze then, her eyes steady and bright with the grief he finally understood, and she said that Emma's place among her people had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with love and promise. A promise that the raiders had tried to break again by taking the girl away. A promise Sahina had crossed half the frontier to keep. Cole felt the truth of that strike deeper than any bullet could, felt the sharp, unmistakable contrast between the justice Sahina lived and the justice Braddock had carved into the land. And for the first time in years, he questioned whether redemption was something a man like him had any right to reach for on a frontier built from the ashes of vengeance. They fled before dawn, slipping out while the horizon was still nothing but a thin bruise of purple against the dying night. Cole leading the horse with Emma wrapped in his coat and Sahina riding close behind, her silhouette sharp and unwavering against the dim days. The air was cold enough to bite, carrying the faint scent of mesquite and ash, and though the world around them held the quiet of early morning, Cole felt no peace in it, only the uneasy heartbeat of pursuit. Emma, half awake and shivering, clung to him at first, still afraid, her trust fragile and trembling like a fledgling trying to understand where safety lived. But as the trail stretched on and the sun began its slow climb over the ridgeline, she shifted towards Sahina, drawn by a familiarity that lived deeper than memory, and Cole watched her small fingers reach for the Comanche woman's hand with a hesitant courage that tightened something inside him. Sahina responded with a soft murmur in her native tongue, a sound like warm wind over tall grass, and Emma leaned into her, shoulders relaxing for the first time since the gunfire, her small face resting against Sahina's arm as if she'd found the missing piece of her world. Gratitude rose in Cole's chest like warmth from a long dormant ember. Gratitude that Emma still had someone who claimed her with a fierceness that was neither possession nor pride but pure, unwavering love. But tangled up in that warmth was the sting of shame, sharp and unavoidable, because he knew he had helped build the world that had taken so much from Sahina's people, and because a child felt safer in Sahina's arms than she ever could in his, no matter how hard he tried to protect her now. He rode a few paces ahead, scanning the ground with that old tracker's instinct Braddock had drilled into him. But where that skill once made him feel capable, now it only fueled dread, for the signs were unmistakable. Fresh hoof prints crossing their path, horses shod with the pattern Braddock preferred, the deep-cut tracks of a heavier stallion he recognized from a lifetime ago, and broken shrubs where men had crouched recently, waiting, watching. Each new sign felt like a tightening noose, and Cole's breath thickened with the knowledge that Braddock's men weren't just looking for Emma. They were hunting him, too, hunting the man who'd walked away from their lawless brotherhood and carried secrets they would kill to bury. The past he'd fled for years, the past he'd convinced himself distance could erase, was closing in with the relentless certainty of a shadow at sunset, and he felt the weight of it pressing on his shoulders like a loaded yoke. Sahina noticed the change in him. She had the uncanny ability to read silence as easily as others read footprints, and she urged her horse closer, her voice low as she asked what he'd seen. He hesitated, not wanting to alarm Emma, but the truth pushed out of him in a rough whisper. Braddock's men were near, maybe half a day behind, maybe less, and the trail showed no deviation, no uncertainty. They were following with purpose, with intent, with the confidence of wolves tracking a wounded deer. Sahina's jaw tightened, her expression shifting into something fierce and resolute, and she pulled Emma closer, shielding the girl with her own body even as she nodded for Cole to continue leading them through the narrow pass ahead. The canyon walls rose like solemn witnesses, their shadows long and stretching, and Cole felt every echo of hooves behind them as though the rock itself carried Brad's breath. He wanted to promise Sienna they would outrun the past, outrun the men who carried it like a plague. But promises felt fragile in the face of a truth he could no longer deny. The life he'd abandoned had never stopped trailing him. It had merely waited for the right moment to return. And now, with Emma's life and Sienna's trust tangled in its wake, Cole understood that the reckoning he'd dodged for years wasn't just coming. It was already here, riding hard on their heels. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. The canyon pass narrowed into a crooked throat of stone where the rising sun could barely crawl in, its pale light slicing thinly across the ground, and Cole felt the crushing weight of the walls on either side as he dismounted to study the trail, hoping he was wrong and knowing he wasn't. The hoof prints he crouched over weren't just signs of pursuit. They were encoded messages written in the same rough script Braddock had beaten into his men years ago, markers only someone who'd once shared their fire could read. And as Cole brushed a fingertip across the deep cut of a stallion's track, a cold certainty crawled up his spine. Braddock wasn't hunting him alone. He was hunting him. Hunting the man who had broken ranks, broken faith, and walked away from the brotherhood Braddock treated like a kingdom carved from dust and blood. A faint scorch mark on a nearby rock made Cole's breath catch, because it wasn't from a gunshot or campfire. It was a sign Braddock left for his men when he wanted them to know the kill ahead was personal, a claim staked like a brand, and seeing it now cracked something open in Cole's chest. A long-buried dread tangled with guilty thought distance had deraced. Sienna watched him with quiet intensity. Emma clutched against her side atop the horse, and though she didn't speak at first, her eyes read the truth in his tense shoulders, in the tremor of his exhale, in the way he stared at the ground as though it held the history of his sins. Cole rose slowly, the canyon suddenly too silent, too expectant, and every memory he'd spent years avoiding flooded back. Braddock teaching him to shoot by aiming at fence posts shaped like men. Braddock calling him brother on nights when the whiskey burned their throats. Braddock convincing him that taking what they wanted was the natural order of the frontier, that justice was fluid and truth belonged to the fastest gun. Cole had followed him because he'd been young, angry, and looking for a place to belong, and he had mistaken Braddock's twisted sense of loyalty for family, had ignored the signs of decay until the raid in Rat Hollow showed him the depths of cruelty he'd been standing beside. He'd walked away after that night, leaving Braddock unconscious from a blow he'd prayed would end the madness. But instead of killing the man, Cole had run, told himself he was choosing a better path, even though he'd never gone back to help the families Braddock destroyed or warn the next ones in line. Sienna finally broke the silence, her voice low but unflinching as she asked what he'd seen, and Cole felt the canyon press its demand upon him. Speak the truth or let it crush him. He told her about the scorch mark, about the tracking patterns he recognized, about Braddock's fury when someone broke loyalty, and though he spoke plainly, each word tasted like rusted metal, scraping old wounds raw. Sienna didn't interrupt, didn't recoil, but her expression hardened with a sorrow that held more weight than anger. She knew too well the price of men like Braddock, knew what it meant for a man to flee responsibility and leave others to suffer the consequences. Emma, sensing the tension, reached for Cole with a small, fragile hand, and the gesture nearly undid him. How could he explain that the very men who had stolen her were molded by the same hand that had once guided his own, that he had not always stood on the side he tried so desperately to protect her from now? As they moved deeper into the past, the walls echoing their footsteps like a slow drumbeat of fate, Cole felt the truth settle on him like a burden carved from stone. Braddock wanted Emma silenced because she carried the memory of his crimes, but he wanted Cole dead because betrayal was the one sin he never forgave. The canyon, with its ancient bones and silent promises, seemed to whisper the question Cole had avoided for years. What kind of man had he been, and what kind of man did he dare to become? Redemption, he realized, was not a trail given, it was a trail earned, bloodied by the choices a man made when every escape had been stripped away. And as the wind picked up, carrying dust in the distant echo of hooves, Cole made the quiet, trembling decision that he would not run anymore. Not from Braddock, not from his past, not from the weight of the promises he'd broken, But whether the choice would save Emma or bury them all, the canyon offered no answer. The abandoned homestead lay crooked against the trembling edge of twilight, its collapsed roof and wind-gnawed porch looking like the ribcage of some long-dead animal, and Cole felt an ache of recognition as he led Sahina and Emma inside. Because places like this, half forgotten, half destroyed, were the kind of places he and Braddock once left behind without looking back. Emma huddled near the fireplace's cold stones while Sahina stood watchful in the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the fading sky. And Cole knew the moment had come, the truth pressing so fiercely inside him it threatened to crack bone. He sank onto a broken chair, breathing in dust thick with old memories, and began to speak, not carefully, not cautiously, but with the rawness of a man pulling barbed wire from his own chest. He told Sahina about Braddock before the scar, before the badge meant nothing, back when they were two men clawing for belonging on a frontier that chewed up the lonely and spit them into graves, and how Braddock had shown him a kind of brotherhood Cole mistook for salvation. Cole confessed how those early raids weren't called raids then. Braddock called them recovery missions, lies polished enough to sound righteous, and how Cole, young and angry, believed him, believed justice could be shaped by whoever held the gun steady. He described the first time they stormed a homestead in the dead of night, how fear twisted truth until he didn't know what side he rode for, how he watched Braddock drag a crying mother into the dirt and convinced himself it was necessary because Braddock said the family sheltered thieves. His voice cracked when he reached the night at Red Hollow, the night Emma's first family died, how he had seen Braddock take a child from a burning home and had done nothing but stand frozen, too afraid to stop him, too ashamed to help, too tangled in loyalty to recognize he had crossed a line there was no honest road back from. Each memory spilled like poison, filling the room until even the cracked walls seemed to flinch under the weight of his confession, and Sahina listened in a silence colder than the night wind creeping through the broken shutters, her face unreadable, her breath measured, her eyes reflecting a history of suffering she had learned to stomach without letting it rot her spirit. Cole kept speaking, because stopping felt like lying, and he told her how he finally broke from Braddock, not in fury nor courage, but in fear. Fear of becoming the same kind of monster, fear of seeing his own reflection in the scorch marks left behind, fear that one day he'd wake up unable to tell right from wrong. He admitted he'd run, abandoning the people Braddock hurt, abandoning responsibility, abandoning even himself. When his voice finally faltered into silence, the only sound was the low whimper of Emma drifting to sleep beside the cold hearth, and Cole waited for Sahina to condemn him, to spit her hatred at his feet, to drag Emma away and call him coward, traitor, killer, because he had been, in pieces, all of those things. Instead, Sahina stepped closer, her expression a strange mixture of pain, calculation, and something quieter, something like resignation, and she told him she had suspected his past from the moment Emma whispered that name, that no ordinary drifter froze like that unless the truth was lodged deep in his bones. She said she had watched him fight, watched him shield Emma, watched him regret with a sincerity she had seen in very few men, and while she did not forgive the history he carried, she had chosen to judge him by who he was now, by the man who stood between a child and the man who shaped him into something he refused to remain. Her words were not soft. Mercy was not in her nature, but they were honest, and the honesty studied Cole like a hand on his back. In the dying light of the ruined homestead, with his sins laid bare and Sahina's wary acceptance settling the air, Cole felt something shift inside him, an understanding that redemption wasn't granted, wasn't deserved, but earned inch by painful inch, and tonight he had taken the first step on a trail he should have walked long ago. The attack came just as the last embers of twilight surrendered to night, a sudden explosion of splintering wood and pounding hooves that shattered the fragile quiet of the broken homestead. Braddock's men poured through the darkness like wolves unleashed, their shadows stretching long across the hard earth as gunfire ripped the air apart. And Cole reacted before thought could catch up, dragging Emma behind the overturned table and shoving Sahina toward the back doorway with a wordless urgency sharpened by dread. The sharp crack of a rifle near the barn made Cole's stomach drop. Braddock had arrived himself. He could feel it, smell it in the twisted precision of the attack. And when a familiar silhouette stepped into the doorway of the ruined house, lantern light glinting off the jagged scar cutting down his right cheek, Cole felt time fold in on itself, dragging him back to every firelit raid they had ridden together, Braddock's grin was a ghost of their old camaraderie, contorted now into something venomous, a mockery of brotherhood as he called Cole's name with a drawl meant to sound like greeting but landing like a thread. He taunted him, saying he'd come for what was his, Emma, the last witness to Red Hollow, the last thread connecting Braddock to the crimes he'd woven so deep into the land that only death could uproot them. And Cole felt his pulse roar in his ears, not from fear but from the pull of violence Braddock had once trained into him, the instinct to match brutality with brutality, to become the weapon he'd sworn never to be again. Sahina fired from the shadows, grazing Braddock's shoulder and drawing a furious curse from him, and chaos erupted, men barking orders, bullets splintering beams, the smell of gunpowder thickening like storm clouds. Cole fought through the noise, staying low, moving with a precision he hated himself for remembering, each motion a ghost returning to life against his will. He dropped one of Braddock's men with a brutal strike, disarming another with a kick that sent a revolver skidding across the dirt. But each moment of skilled violence felt like a step backward into the man he used to be, the man Braddock had molded from anger and loneliness. Braddock pushed deeper into the house, boots thudding like war drums, and when he grabbed a lantern and hurled it at the floorboards to flush them out with flame, the room burst alive with firelight and Emma screamed, a sound that sliced through Cole like a blade. He lunged forward, tackling Braddock into the fallen rafters, and they grappled in the flickering orange glow, two ghosts from the same graveyard wrestling over the last scrap of redemption. Braddock hissed that Cole owed him blood for his betrayal, that Emma was nothing but a loose end, that the frontier bowed to men bold enough to take what they wanted. Cole felt his fists tighten, old instincts urging him to crush the life out of the man who had corrupted so much of his youth, urging him to end the terror at its source. But Sahina's cries and Emma's trembling breath pulled him back from the cliff, reminding him that killing Braddock out of rage would make him no different from the man beneath him. He forced his blows to slow, to soften, to shift from vengeance to necessity, restraining instead of destroying, disarming instead of killing, even as Braddock clawed at him with the desperation of a man who'd built his entire identity on fear and domination. A gunshot cracked, Sahina, steady and precise, shattering the weapon in Braddock's hand and leaving him momentarily stunned. Cole used that second to wrench him to the floor, pinning him beneath the collapsed timber as firelight danced across Braddock's enraged face, showing a man who couldn't comprehend losing control. Braddock screamed threats, promises of retribution, vows that Cole and the child would never outrun him. But his men, now wounded or dead, were already scattering into the night, their assault broken, their leader pinned. Cole rose slowly, chest heaving, hands shaking, not from fear, but from the effort of holding himself back from becoming the monster Braddock had once shaped him to be. Emma clung to Sahina, eyes wide, but when she looked at Cole, something like trust, fractured, fragile, but real, returned to her gaze, and Cole understood that the battle he'd fought tonight was not just against Braddock's man but against the darkness within himself, a darkness he would have to confront again before the dawn. The fire spread fast, crawling along the dry beams of the old homestead like a living memory of every blaze Braddock had ever left behind, and the final clash erupted in the glow of that rising inferno as if the past itself had come back to watch. Sahina, moving with a mother's ferocity sharpened by years of loss, scooped Emma into her arms the moment the girl broke free from the overturned table, shielding her from flying embers as she dashed toward the broken back doorway, shouting for Cole to finish what he had started, her voice cracking with the weight of trust she had not granted lightly. Cole barely heard her over the roar of flames and Braddock's ragged snarling, for Braddock had fought free of the fallen raptors and hurled himself at Cole with the frenzy of a wounded predator, their bodies crashing against the wall in a violent tangle of fists, elbows, and years of rotten history. It felt less like a fight and more like the resurrection of every moment they had ever shared as brothers in arms, every raid, every oath, every quiet night by the fire where Braddock had whispered poison into the hollow places of a young man who had wanted family more than truth. Braddock swung wild at first, fueled by rage rather than tactics, but soon the old rhythm reawakened in both of them, the brutal dance they'd once mastered together, their movements syncing and clashing with a familiarity Cole found sickening. They grappled through the smoke, slamming into broken furniture, rolling through dust and debris, Braddock laughing through bloody teeth every time Cole hesitated, taunting him with the reminder that he'd once been cut from the same foul cloth. In the corner of his vision, Cole saw Sahina sprint into the night with Emma pressed tight to her chest, the child's small arms wrapped around her like a lifeline. And that sight, of safety, of a future he had no right to claim but could still protect, struck something vital inside him, something Braddock had crushed long ago. Braddock saw the shift, the flicker of resolve, and he roared, slamming Cole onto a half-burned table, reaching for a shard of glass to finish the job. But Cole rolled aside, grabbing Braddock's arm and twisting with a precision he had sworn never to use again. They fell together, crashing into the dirt floor, Braddock on top for a moment, his fingers tightening around Cole's throat in a grip stronger than hatred, his spit-flecked words dripping over Cole like venom as he cursed him for running, for surviving, for daring to stand against the man who had created him. Cole felt the darkness edging in, the old urge to simply let go and allow the violent instinct Braddock had planted in him to take over, to end the fight with one merciless act. But Sahina's earlier words, her refusal to judge him by the man he had been, cut through the haze like clean air in a smoke-filled room, and Cole made a choice born not of rage but of reclamation. With a desperate surge of strength, he rolled him again, pinning Braddock beneath him, using leverage rather than cruelty, forcing the shard from the man's grip and holding him down with a steadiness Braddock had never possessed. Braddock thrashed, cursed, spat every vile word he could muster, promising that Cole would die hunted, die alone, die remembered as nothing more than his failed protege. But his voice cracked, weakened, and then faltered as the burning beams above them groaned and split, sending a fiery rapture collapsing across his chest. Cole scrambled back as the weight pinned Braddock to the ground, his former friend's face twisted in fury and disbelief, and in his final rasping breath Braddock used his last strength not to beg, not to confess, but to curse Cole one last time for betraying him, his voice fading into the roar of flames as the fire swallowed him. Cole stood trembling, chest heaving, the heat searing his skin as he backed toward the exit where dawn's first light touched the ground beyond the door. He felt no triumph, no glory, only a strange, quiet grief and the heavy breath of clarity as he realized that defeating Braddock had not been the battle, only the breaking point. Outside, Sahina and Emma waited, silhouettes against a horizon finally opening to morning, and Cole understood with aching certainty that the only road worth walking now was one built not on penance alone but on change, on breaking free from the man Braddock had shaped him to be, and choosing, step by difficult step, the man he was meant to become. The world felt strangely quiet after the fire died and Braddock's shadow finally loosened its grip on the night, the kind of quiet that settles over land too long soaked in violence, as if the earth itself needed to breathe again. Dawn crept slowly over the horizon, brushing the blackened homestead with soft gold, and in that newborn light Sahina gathered Emma onto her horse, wrapping her in a woven blanket that carried the colors of her people and the warmth of a home reclaimed. Emma's small hand brushed Cole's arm before she left, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Thank you, Cole," but the words struck him with unexpected force, blooming through the ash-covered ache inside him like the first fragile sprout after a wildfire, and he found himself swallowing hard as he answered with a nod he hoped carried all the things he wasn't brave enough to say. Sahina mounted behind the child, her posture tall and steady despite the exhaustion etched into her bones, and when she turned to Cole her gaze was no longer guarded with suspicion nor hardened by grief. Instead, it held a solemn recognition, the kind given only when someone has seen the worst of a man and still manages to acknowledge the part that chose differently. She told him, her voice low and sure, that while he had repaid the debt carved into the past, redemption was not something handed down like judgment. It was a trail walked step by step, shaped by choices made when no one was watching, earned in the long miles between violence and peace. Cole felt those words settle in his chest like a compass finally pointing true north, and when Sahina added that Emma would grow no courage did not always come from blood but sometimes from strangers who refused to run, he had to look away toward the rising sun just to steady himself. The horses shifted, snorting gently as the morning wind carried the scent of distant cedar, and Sahina gave him a single, respectful nod before nudging the mare forward. Emma glanced back over her shoulder, offering him a tired but hopeful smile, and Cole watched them ride into the soft blush of dawn, their silhouettes slowly shrinking along the trail that wound toward the Comanche lands, a place of healing he had no right to intrude upon, but was grateful existed for the girl who had carried pieces of his past like shards of glass. As their forms blended into the horizon, Cole remained standing in the charred ruin of the homestead, the cool morning air prickling his skin, his palms still stained with soot in the memory of choices he could never erase. Yet for the first time in years, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter, not gone, but no longer crushing, as if the prairie wind had taken some small measure of it from him. He realized, with a quiet ache, that he was no longer the man Braddock had shaped, nor the frightened drifter who had spent years running from his own reflection. He was something unfinished, unsteady, but maybe, just maybe, capable of becoming better. As the sun rose higher, gilding the land with soft warmth, Cole gathered his horse, tightened the worn saddle straps, and took one last look at the trail Sahina and Emma had followed. He didn't know where his own road would lead, only that it would not be the same one he'd walked before. With a long breath that tasted of smoke, dust, and possibility, Cole swung into the saddle and turned toward the open frontier, wondering if there was still room in its vast, scarred beauty for a man trying to rebuild himself from the ruins. The morning answered with silence, but the kind that felt like a beginning. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.